Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This would probably be controversial among my friends in the Biden administration, but I think that there's a general perception that Vice President Harris will be a bit more business-friendly.
Welcome back to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries, and economies like never before. So we've created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Allegra Stratton.
I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And I'm Stephanie Flanders.
So, look, we are 7 minutes out from the...
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Sorry.
if only it was 7 minutes.
Obviously, leave that in. Fail in the first 10 seconds. We are 7 weeks out from the US election, and although the outcome is no clearer, the end is coming into sight. So we're going to continue to unpick what the candidates' financial and regulatory policies could mean for American businesses.
And one of the things we're going to get into later, Adrian and I spoke with one of Wall Street's higher profile Democrats and Evercore chairman emeritus, Ralph Schlosstein, one of its founders, just to get an idea of what the potential ideas could mean for business. You know, he's sitting in Wall Street, or certainly was sitting in Wall Street, and has a particular perspective that you might say was a kind of traditional approach to thinking about business and campaigns. You know, how much money are they putting in? What impact are the candidates' policies going to have? But Adrian, and I don't know about you, but I've just been struck, you know, Donald Trump progressively has so scrambled the way we think about business and politics and brought them closer and closer together. And we've seen that particularly in the increasingly close relationship between him and Elon Musk, where Elon Musk is not just giving him a huge amount of money, but giving him a platform, actively supporting him on Twitter.
Absolutely. There used to be a sort of hands-off relationship between the donor on the one hand and the candidate on the other. The donor would give some money, it would go through a lot of intermediaries, and there'd be some sort of space between the two. Now you're getting a direct intermingling between business on the one hand and the candidates on the other. Trump obviously did this at its most flagrant with his hotel in Washington that he encouraged people to go into. But now we're seeing with Musk is running this business, which is X, Twitter, but part of the business model seems to be outrage people, to put Trump on there, to encourage sort of active engagement with Twitter through saying Trump-leaning things. So it's an extraordinary sort of commingling, I think.
And also there's a kickback because if Trump's elected, Musk is going to be given this role looking at... So there's, and I do try not to be too parochial and bring it back to UK, but in the UK right now, we're having every day on the front page, we've got the Prime Minister and his wife being accused for taking clothes and money off, well, money's not the problem, but clothes and other benefits that they haven't declared off a donor on the one hand. But then in America, you've got it on a mega scale, and it doesn't, not mega, but a mega scale, and it doesn't seem to... There doesn't seem to be anybody who's saying, hold on a second, it's not allowed.
Well, except, I mean, there's plenty of people amazed at the kind of conflict of interest that would represent. I mean, remember, it's not just that it's payback for support in their campaign. It would be an ongoing and massive conflict of interest for Elon Musk to be reinventing government or thinking about how to reduce government at a time when his own company is receiving billions of dollars in government contracts. So the idea that there are no guardrails against that, I think, is surprising to people in America, where we're always taught that, you know, there is this written constitution that provides checks and balances. They're increasingly getting faded.
If you read the biography of Musk, it's clear that about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, Musk thought Trump was a loser. And maybe that's even a direct quote.
Well, not very long ago, Donald Trump thought cryptocurrencies were a scam, and we now know that he's going to get his own.
Okay, so to talk about that change of heart that Stephanie just mentioned and how crypto is playing in the US election, we have in the podcast studio right now Emily Nicolle, who is Bloomberg's crypto reporter. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
Just explain for us what was launched by Donald Trump and family this week.
Launched may be a bit of a generous term, actually. More like unveiled to a certain extent. So earlier this week, Donald Trump went on an X Spaces, I guess you'd call it now, where he spoke for about 2 hours along with other members of the Trump family about the project that they intend to launch called World Liberty Financial. We still don't really know what it is, except for the fact that it's going to be in the world of decentralized finance, which means that there will be some loose form of governance by the people and the community that are buying into it rather than by the people running it, and that there will be a token attached to it for that purpose, which people can buy to use to vote on proposals on how it's run, but also probably speculate with as well.
So for an expert like yourself, does it look promising or does it look a bit odd?
It looks light on details. I think
it's probably not the first crypto enterprise that's been a bit light on details.
Yeah, exactly. But it's probably the most high profile one that we've had so far.
Yeah.
I mean, for a prospective president to be launching something like this, it definitely is in that grey area of we don't know exactly where it sits between business interests, financial interests, how much he might stand to profit from it or benefit from it. There is a disclaimer on the project that says Trump or his family members, none of them will benefit financially from it. But, that's assuming that the token itself isn't going to be something that can appreciate in value. Obviously it will. So, whether or not that actually bears out to be the case is something to be seen.
Adrian, I mean, before we get on to talking to Emily about crypto in the election, just sort of on the principle of a presidential candidate launching or unveiling, to use Emily's phrase, unveiling something like this, would we see that in the UK?
No, I can't conceivably imagine it. It's not just that he's unveiling this thing as a presidential candidate. He's doing it 7 weeks before the election on a platform provided by one of his biggest backers, Elon Musk. It's quite extraordinary.
And it's also the intermingling with the family. The family are ever present,
Totally.
The business interests continue with the family. And I noticed even in our story that the white paper it sounds like white paper is also a sort of a generous phrase, but the World Liberty Financial, reviewed by Bloomberg News, listed Donald Trump as chief crypto advocate, Eric and Donald Jr. each as Web3 ambassadors, and 18-year-old Barron Trump as chief DeFi visionary. I guess we should, DeFi is a sort of particular bit of the crypto universe, which is even considered a little bit fringe even by some of the crypto people. Is that right?
Somewhat, yes. I mean, if you're kind of the person on the street
finance.
who would buy Bitcoin or Ether because you think it might be a bit of investment, then DeFi is certainly fringe to you. For crypto traders, though, it's kind of the bread and butter of how things work, because it's often the way that you get to experiment with new tokens, new projects and things before they can get vetted properly to be on the big exchanges like Binance or Coinbase. For Trump in this project, the purpose of it being in DeFi is quite important because it means that they can have this claim to not really have any control or say over how it operates. DeFi itself as a construct is, imagine a project that's basically just a whole run of code and smart contracts that kind of execute when certain conditions are met and nobody can intervene once they're written. So the idea is that people who hold this token that's attached to the project can use that bit of token that they own to say, okay, well, I vote this way, and somebody with more tokens can vote another way. And in that way, the Trump family themselves can say, well, really, I don't have any say over how this goes because all the token holders are voting whichever way. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't benefit financially from it, though, especially if the token does trade in open markets, which it should do in time.
I mean, there is this a bit of the sort of demographic that Trump is really going for, which is the sort of countercultural, younger, skeptical of government. And this is right. Even if they don't make any money on this, it does sort of send that message that I'm all about sort of somewhat, it's getting away from the mainstream financial system, libertarianism. I mean, that's part of the messaging.
Yeah. All of those things are kind of at the heart of crypto. And so a lot of the traders who sit within crypto, or at least, hardcore day-to-day live and breathe it, very much sit on that side. But then you have to wonder if that they would have been Trump voters anyway, to a certain extent. And so Trump has made repeated overtures to the crypto industry this year to say that he wants to be part of it. He wants to create rules for it. He wants to get rid of SEC Chair Gary Gensler on day one because Gary Gensler has been launching several enforcement actions against crypto companies over the last few years that the industry perceives as overly harsh. But, saying all of that was probably enough, because by comparison, his competitor, Kamala Harris, hasn't really said anything on crypto.
I mean, when it comes to the sort of directly benefiting financially from the campaign, we had that, Trump Media IPO in April. Originally, it was valued at $9 billion. I think it's now less than half that. He could still potentially make $2 billion. And people are literally trading him, and it's been going down pretty steadily, certainly since Biden got out of the race. If people end up trading on this platform, which is very much associated with him, if they're speculating on Trump Media stocks based on whether or not they think he's going to win, and then they end up losing a lot of money, I mean, doesn't that backfire on him in the end, or does it not matter because he's lost? And
it depends how much he can distance himself from it. I mean, the ability to be able to say, well, we don't earn any money from this. I'm just an advisor, or I sit on the periphery. I'm just promoting it, but my family are really more involved, these kind of things. There's always a way for him to distance himself. That said, we did do a story, my colleagues Zeke Fox and Miao Shen, earlier this month about the people behind the project who are building it. And they have previously built projects that have been subject to hacks. They've done get-rich-quick schemes. They've sold colon cleansers online. It's not necessarily the kind of business that you think would be solid footing. So looking ahead to what world liberty might look like, I mean, there's always a chance, for example, that they don't launch this before the election happens. And so he's able to kind of say that, well, nothing infringed upon the voting process in a certain sense. But once it goes live, there's nothing to say, I guess, that he couldn't still sit on those edges without having all his fingers in.
I guess this is all part of why it must be interesting day to day to be a Bloomberg crypto reporter. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you.
My top fact, I was looking up while we were talking, that Trump Media's revenue is equivalent, and I have to admit this is according to Reuters, but is equivalent to 2 Starbucks coffee shops. And strategists say its $3.6 billion stock market value is detached from its day-to-day business since it lost just under $900,000 in its most reported quarter. I love that. It's worth several $1 billion, and its revenue is the same as two
Starbucks
coffee shops.
Yeah.
We have our guest this week. Adrian and I spoke with one of Wall Street's higher-profile Democrats a few days ago, Ralph Schlosstein, chairman emeritus at Evercore, which is a global investment banking advisory business. And I started by asking him, at this late stage in the campaign, was it really going to come down to who had the most money?
I think the answer to that is, how much does the relative net worth of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett matter? Both of them have more money than they need.
They don't have instant access to massive social media platforms, though.
And I would say both campaigns have more than enough money to promote their candidate. And the differential in money, which at least at the current moment seems to favor Vice President Harris, is not going to be the determining factor in this election.
Can you give us a general sense of how corporate America, business America, is seeing and splitting over this debate? Are there any clear lines of difference between different business groupings? And is it changing as the election evolves?
This would probably be controversial among my friends in the Biden administration, but I think that there's a general perception that Vice President Harris will be a bit more business friendly, large technology and corporate business friendly. And I think some of that is a function of her background and where she comes from. She's represented in the Senate many of these large technology companies. Obviously, Silicon Valley is in California, and she's got a long history of interacting with them, being supported by them, and having, I think, some empathy to the issues that might be of interest to them. And that's not to say that President Biden has been hostile toward business, but he's got less of a background and an empathy toward that. And he's got a very strong background in foreign policy, and that's been a big focus of his. I think her agenda is very focused on two things: growth for the overall economy, which I think is really important, as there is something to be said for this long around quote of the rising tide lifting all ships. And then she's also, I think, very focused on moving a little bit more of the benefits of public policy to the middle class, her housing plan, her child care plan, her child credit, tax credit, capping drug prices, and the fact, there's going to be a massive discussion next year about what do we do with the Trump tax cuts. They all expire at the end of 2025. And there's probably the biggest difference between the two candidates, which neither of them talks particularly a lot about, is what their view is of what should happen to that next year.
Against that, I just want to say that surely we're seeing business fleeing from California at a significant rate, and middle-class people fleeing from California at a significant rate, because it's hard for middle-class people to make ends meet, and businesses feel that the burden of regulation is and intrusiveness of regulation is very high. If I was looking at California, I wouldn't say that that's the sort of place I wanted to do business these days.
Well, it has a lot of things going for it, too. It has an incredibly educated labor force, and it's been, until relatively recently, an engine of demographic growth for the United States. So, there certainly are highly publicized, occasionally controversial figures like Elon Musk who make very strong statements about the friendliness of the California business climate. And I do think, as a general matter, the Democratic Party has been a little bit excessive in its regulatory exuberance. And that's true at the national level. And it's certainly true in the states where you have one party rule, one of which I live in.
I'm interested, there's been quite a lot of talk, you actually just mentioned it there, about quite unpopular characters in large parts of the business community that are currently in the administration of it. Lina Khan and Gary Gensler, the head of so Lina Khan being the Federal Trade Commission head and the Securities and Exchange Commission head, Gary Gensler. Lina Khan in particular has distinguished herself for a sort of pro-competitive, quite aggressive approach to at least starting to regulate big tech companies and others. Then more generally, I would say there's a sort of interesting dividing line between right and left in large parts of the world now, where it's actually the left, the progressive side is talking more. I don't know if they've done a lot more, but talking a lot more about competition and worried about concentration of corporate power. Lina Khan is a sort of symbolic figure for many people in the more progressive side of Democrats because she has been considered to be quite radical. Should Kamala Harris worry about that? Whether or not she gets reappointed, is that going to be a key issue?
A very high-quality news organization, Bloomberg, that wrote a story about how donors and supporters of Kamala Harris were suggesting that their support or donation should be conditioned upon the removal of her. And I wasn't quoted in that story, but I was called about it. And I said that I thought that was highly premature and ridiculous. Other than that, completely true. And the reason I do believe that, first of all, you have antitrust policy and competition policy. There hasn't been a single change in law since probably 2000 or earlier. I said in 2017 that I thought one of the most difficult professional jobs in America under President Trump was to be an antitrust lawyer, because the law didn't really matter. It was whether he liked you or not. So he went after the Time Warner AT&T merger because he hated CNN. And of course, they got thrown out in court. We had an experience where we had a merger held up at Evercore, held up under CFIUS, which was, by the way, a merger of two U.S. companies, had nothing to do with CFIUS.
CFIUS is the American law that is used to prevent foreign companies from taking big stakes of US companies.
Yes, buying U.S. companies. So this was two American companies, and it was held up for a long time. And then one of the companies decided to redomicile one of their headquarters back into the United States. And lo and behold, a week later, the merger got approved. Nothing to do with law. I think the current group, and Lena Khan is the tip of the spear there, but the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust is certainly part of that as well, Kaplan. They've been definitely more aggressive in their interpretation of the law. They've gone to court a number of times and lost. They've won a couple. And so we spend a lot of time at Evercore with companies talking about mergers, and this is always a part of the discussion. And I would say the prevailing view among larger companies today is if we believe the law is on our side, we may be challenged, but we'll go to court and we'll win. I do think my guess would be that there would be a somewhat moderated view of that particular, of the FTC and the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust under Vice President Harris, with her legal background and sensitivity to some of the issues that business cares about, might care a little bit more about how those particular roles are executed.
There are some who say that the potentially more influential than you would think point of disagreement between Trump and Harris is the attitude to crypto, because it is gaining so many aficionados, particularly in kind of demographics that Kamala Harris is trying to attract. And Trump has changed his view on crypto, but has now been pretty positive about it. We think that's partly why Elon Musk is so supportive of him, whereas Gary Gensler stands for a much more circumspect and potentially negative approach. Do you think that is? Are we underestimating how much that matters?
I would say it to me, it's a fringe issue, not a central issue. I think the change on President Trump's part has been definitely linked in a pretty material way to the contributions that have been made. There's an interest group out there that has a PAC that is giving tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in this election cycle to crypto-friendly candidates, including former President Trump.
But you're sitting in a mainstream Wall Street firm. Maybe you'd always say that.
I must say I'm in the world that things, and I probably a complete Paleoanthic era troglodyte. I have said in the past that to me, the valuation of Bitcoin reminded me of the Beanie Baby craze. But I think that's turned out to be a not necessarily correct view. And I think it remains to be seen whether there are any mainstream uses of these electronic monetary vehicles other than a store of value and speculation.
I wanted to ask about something else, which is what might be briefly called woke capital, or the passion for micro intervention in the way that businesses run themselves through DEI and ESG and the rest of it. Is Vice President Harris an advocate of that? And if she is that a problem for business?
I think I'm very passionate about the objectives of some of that. I think there are really good business reasons to have a diverse workforce, and I can articulate those for you if you want. But I do think the prescriptive nature of this, which has been broadly thrown into the pejorative term woke capitalism, is not is overdone. I really do. And I stepped down as CEO of Evercore about 2.5 years ago. And one of the things I've said privately more than once is that being the CEO of a public company today is just a lot more challenging and less clear as to what you're really trying to accomplish. Evercore is a independent investment banking firm. We don't have any balance sheet. We have offices. And the idea that we would be required to file a lengthy environmental statement about whether our buildings are eco-friendly or not is, in my view, complete nonsense. Obviously, if you're a chemical company, you should be focused on that. If you're an energy company, you should be focused on the environmental aspects of your business. But it has gone way too far. The goals that they're trying to achieve are laudable. What's gone way overboard is the prescriptive exuberance with which they pursue them.
From the sort of Evercore perspective, should anyone be trading this election? How does one trade this election?
I'm not sure how to trade even without an election. So with an election, it becomes harder. I'm just not. I think the only thing that I do think is truly market affecting is I do believe that if Trump were to pursue the tariff policies that he's discussed in the campaign, and it's not clear to me that he would pursue them, but if he were to pursue those, which would be very high tariffs across the board and almost using that as the principal source of new revenue to finance the government, I think that will have a very chilling effect on the markets, and because it will be widely perceived to be anti-trade and inflationary. And I think neither of those things are good for equity markets.
It's interesting you say that. There is a Wall Street view that I would say is quite common, which is that longer term, the macroeconomic mix under Donald Trump would undoubtedly be less sustainable, more risky, bad for the US, bad for the world, higher inflation, as you say, reduced trade connections, an enormous deficit. It's going to be pretty large under either administration, but under a completely out of control deficit. But I've seen plenty of notes coming through my email saying it will be bullish for risk assets in the first year or so because you would have these tax cuts. You would have a feeling that business was not going to be constrained by regulations, by the long arm of the state, all these things that you even just talked about just now.
I think it's interesting. I remember that in 2016, the election, I happened to be in Paris at the time, and my phone rang at 5 a.m, and it was Ed Hyman, who was the founder of ISI and now the chairman of Evercore ISI, and the noted, I think he's number one in institutional investor research for over 40 years as economist. And he said he was in Tokyo and he was about to speak to a bunch of institutional investors. And at that point, it was clear that Trump was going to be elected, and the S&P was down 1,000 points, futures, not the market. And he said, "What should I say?" And I said, "If you want to be controversial or provocative," and I said, "I really believe this, by the way, I think you should say that notwithstanding the fact that the S&P is down 1,000 points, futures are down 1,000 points right now. By the time the market closes at 4:00 in New York, the market will be up." And he said, "Why do you say that?" And I said, "Donald Trump is going to be for lower corporate taxes. He's going to be for a stimulative fiscal policy. He's going to be for infrastructure investment. And that's very bullish for the equity markets. And people will realize that." And so he got up and said that, and it turned out to be, I'm only telling you this story because for once I was right. And I do think that the initial effect, let's take the corporate tax rate, for example, which is at 21% right now, leaving aside state and local taxes, which won't be changing much. If it's at 21%, for every dollar a company makes, 79 cents of it will go to its shareholders and 21 cents to the U.S. government. If it's at 28%, as Vice President Harris has suggested, and I'm not sure it'll ever get that high again, but that's a 7 percentage point off of 79, which is like a 10% decline in corporate earnings. Ultimately, that filters through to the valuation of stocks. If it's at 15%, that's 6 points it's a 7.5% increase in what shareholders will get. The math's pretty simple. I think that point alone will provide, if Trump is elected, will provide a little bit of following wind to the stock market.
But one thing we have in the UK is quite a lot of concern in the City of London and elsewhere that the moves that the new Labour government might make to increase the amount of money coming from the richest and from wealth are already encouraging people to leave for Italy or leave for America. Quite a lot of concern about capital flight. Do you think there's any issue around that if Kamala Harris stays in, just as a sort of attractiveness of the US versus other places as a wealthy person for wealthy people? Not referring to you specifically as a wealthy person, but I bet you hang out with a few.
I'll tell you my personal view on this first. My personal view on this is my parents were both immigrants. My father was a bartender, and I managed to do reasonably well in my life. I have an enormous amount of gratitude and appreciation both for the United States and the opportunities it provides and for New York City. I'm not one of these people who's going to abandon ship because I can save a little money or a lot of money on taxes. I think you have to look at, for the broader question, it's pretty stunning what has happened in the world in terms of the U.S. economy and the U.S. markets relative to the Europes and relative to the Japans. And if you look at in 2008, the GDP of Europe, including the UK, and the US were roughly equal. By 2016, the US was about 50% higher, and today it's almost double. Taxes are about, what do you get to keep of what you've made? The opportunities to make are so great in the US relative to other places in the world, even with Lena Khan sitting in the seat that she sits in and Gary Gensler sitting in the seat that he sits in. I think people who are sitting on a lot of money are going to attracted to places like Monaco and Liechtenstein and places like that. But the last time I went to the opera, I wasn't overwhelmed with the quality of the performance.
Why hasn't that extraordinary economic growth in the US translated into more optimistic sentiments? Why is an incumbent struggling to be re-elected after this incredible economic boom?
It is shocking, actually. I think it's a really good question, and I think the reason for it is the widespread and pernicious effect on people's psyches of inflation. I was working in the White House between 1977 and early 81 under President Carter when we had the greatest inflation in the history of the United States. And I have said a number of times to people who worked in the Biden administration that you have to recognize that inflation is something that touches every single person in the country in a negative way. And when your wages go up, but you go into the grocery store every week and you're spending 20%, 30%, 40% more for eggs and milk and things that you buy every week, or for gasoline, it's in your face, and it's really discouraging and off-putting. And I think, to me, unemployment's horrible, but if unemployment's high at 6% or 7%, it touches a relatively small portion of the economy, of the voter population and their families and friends and such. It's certainly a big issue, and its effect, obviously, on those people is more dramatic than inflation. But inflation touches everybody, and in my view, it's a cloud over the confidence that people have about the economy.
So, Ralph, you've given us a lot of time. We're going to let you go in a second, but I can't help asking you, if you were in Paris on the night of the 2016, where are you planning to be for this election, and maybe cast some light on what you think the outcome's going to be?
I'm going to be in New York. I'm going to be with my 2 children and a bunch of friends at an election party somewhere. And gosh, I have no better insight into who's going to win than I do into what the markets are going to do between now and the end of the year. I hope it's Vice President Harris. I actually think she's better for the country. I think she's younger. She brings, I think to me, one of the great issues in our country and globally is the widening gap of wealth between the 1% and the other 99%, and particularly the 80% that is the middle class and those who have less means than the middle class. And I think she's really attentive to that. And I believe that issue unattended will ultimately corrode support for capitalism and free democratic institutions.
Ralph Schlosstein, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, with Stephanie Flanders and Adrian Wooldridge. It was produced by Summer Sardi. Production support from Chris Martlew and Isabella Ward. Sound design by Blake Maples. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. And special thanks to Ralph Schlosstein and Emily Nicolle. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.